Welcome back. My intention is that today's video is going to be the last one for a while here on the Lydia Immigrant channel on what scholars really think about things in relation to the supposed minimal facts that are used for a minimal facts argument for the resurrection of Jesus. There are additional notes that I have that I'll allude to today. And it's not that I'm unwilling to go into those additional notes in detail, but that I've done a lot of that already, and I want to touch on other topics, especially for viewers who might be interested in other topics or who might have had enough of this topic for a while. So last time, as you remember, I called it, no, not those group appearance experiences. And so today we're going to talk about who does and doesn't acknowledge at least one group appearance of Jesus to his disciples, not that he was really there, but an appearance experience. They might or might not think that in some sense he was really there, but watering down the interesting content to something much less than it's even seeming like what we find in the Gospels. Do they at least acknowledge that? Some kind of group appearance experience. And I'm going to read an interesting definition of it here in a minute that I think is useful for purposes of this question. The hope, of course, is that if you water down the content enough, then you can garner a broad and strong scholarly consensus. So bear in mind at all times here that a scholar can acknowledge a group appearance of some kind while even denying that it was anything like those that are found in the Gospels. In fact, every individual or group, I'll mention the Jesus Seminar, every individual or group that I'll be discussing today is in that camp. They either outright deny that it was like those in the Gospels, or they refuse to commit themselves in that. They're like strongly agnostic on what it was like, and even in some cases strongly agnostic on whether there was a group experience at all. Now we're going to try to figure out if the majority of skeptical scholars or non-believers grant that, and then ask that question again for a group that I've called moderate. In the live stream about a year ago that I've been talking about these last few weeks, where Dr. Licona and Dr. Habermas were talking about group experiences, you'll recall that Dr. Licona got a bit of a surprise there, it appeared, because Dr. Habermas was saying, I never defined vast majority, and I never did a head count except for the empty tomb and so forth. And then Dr. Licona also had trouble getting Dr. Habermas to name a lot of skeptical scholars who grant group appearances. And that's kind of how it all got started. This whole discussion where all these revelations were made was with the question, is a group appearance a minimal fact? So Licona gave what I think is useful here as a kind of definition. And so he's asking Habermas to name scholars who, as he says, would say that groups of people simultaneously had an experience that they interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to them, and that these appearances were so similar that they thought they saw the same thing. That's an interesting way to put it. These appearances were so similar, simultaneously, that they thought they saw the same thing. So bear this in mind when someone says that we just have no idea what happened. That's a far cry from even this limited degree of intersubjectivity in some kind of group experience. All right. Now, as you recall, I made lists of skeptical scholars and moderate scholars, and I was trying to follow up people whom Dr. Habermas especially mentions and says, this guy even says this, and makes it sound like this guy acknowledges something really interesting about the appearances. And then there was one, Walter Sinnott Armstrong, that I included because he had a debate with William Lane Craig. Okay, so remember that a non-believer here doesn't just mean not a Christian. So I haven't even been looking into Pincus Lapide because he's remained a Jew, but it's very explicit, everywhere you check, he believes in the resurrection. So, he's definitely not going to be a non-believer. I mean, it's almost like a pun to call him a non-believer because he's a Jew. A non-believer is supposed to mean, and this is how it's clearly being used in, say, the joint book written by Doctors Habermas and Lacona, someone who doesn't believe in the resurrection. Not even a spiritual resurrection, not even a objective vision. And I'm going to be talking about objective vision people in my moderate category. All right, so here's my list of non-believers. Norman Perrin, Bart Ehrman, Gerhard Ludemann, Michael Goulder, Christopher Knight, Funk, and the Jesus Seminar, and I'll be talking in a minute here about how many scholars we should take this to represent. A.J.M. Wedderburn, John Dominic Crossan, and Walter Sinnott Armstrong. And so for the vast majority of these, and I really do mean, I think all of them except for Armstrong, maybe Knight, but all of the others have been cited by Dr. Habermas in some sort of excited way as saying, even Bart Ehrman grants this, even Funk and the Jesus Seminar grant that, which is what drew my attention to them. Like, okay, what did they say that was so exciting and so interesting? Now, there are two more that Dr. Habermas definitely wants to count as non-believers based on the live stream. I think they might better be called moderates. They themselves certainly position themselves as moderates, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to just acquiesce and count them as non-believers because it doesn't help much. And those are Geza Vermes. I did some research since my last video to figure out how to correctly pronounce his name, Geza Vermes, and E.P. Sanders, sometimes called Ed Sanders. All right. And then my list of moderates, Dale Allison, C.H. Dodd, James Dunn, Theodore Keim, Wolfhart Pannenberg, Reginald Fuller, and David Catchpole. So these are people who definitely believe in, that something objective happened there, not just, some kind of hallucination or whatever. And some of them are even counted as Christians. I'm not sure I would count them as Christians, but the point is they're not just skeptics. Okay. Now, why is this idea of a group experience so important for evaluating the minimal facts argument on its own terms? Because it fulfills a very important role of, as if it's a minimal fact, and actually, I'll be reading in a moment, they actually seem to be saying it definitely is a minimal fact, in the historical bedrock case of Dr. Lacona and in Dr. Habermas's minimal facts case. Every time they talk about, hallucinations or something like that, they're bringing up, but they had group experiences, okay, or they had at least one group experience, etc., and using that. So it's playing an argumentative role in a case that is supposedly based only on what is granted by the vast majority of scholars across the spectrum, including non-believers. And in their joint book, as I read a little, couple weeks ago, I think it was, they explicitly say that this means including a majority of non-believers, not just a majority of scholars, including a couple of non-believers. You can see the difference there. And they say they're only using facts that have this property. And there really is, I think, some back and forth that goes on with this. A majority of skeptics, a lot of skeptics. When Habermas is talking with Lacona in the live stream, I've been talking about, Lacona's like, well, so do a lot of skeptics acknowledge that? And then he's like, can you tell me one non-believer, one skeptic who acknowledges this? We're kind of coming down in our requests. All right. And even in his most recent work, in volume 1 of his magnum opus, Habermas says that this is a minimal fact. Quote, this chapter centered on probably the most crucial of the half-dozen minimal facts the disciples' post-crucifixion experiences, both singly and in groups, which convinced them firmly that Jesus had been raised from the dead and had appeared to them. So that's page 432 in Dr. Habermas's volume 1 of On the Resurrection. He also makes much of this, even skeptical scholars in volume 1 on page 103. After all, if even skeptical scholars were to agree with a basic outline of particular knowable data, then such a foundation may probably be due, weird phrase, to a well-evidenced and underlying common ground upon which the major questions may proceed. Well, it's not a very well-written sentence, but it certainly is getting rhetorical mileage out of this idea of even skeptical scholars agreeing. Okay, now I have followed up on each one of the individuals just listed in that skeptical group and on the Jesus Seminar book, The Acts of Jesus, which Habermas uses to document the views of the Jesus Seminar in his most recent work. All right, I have also investigated Vaguest and Sanders and all of the individual moderates, carefully following up on references and quotes that Habermas gives. For the skeptics, the seminar as a group, and Vaguest and Sanders, based on my research, only maybe Vaguest, he's kind of unclear, Gulder and Gerd Ludemann acknowledge some kind of appearance experienced by a group. Needless to say, not like the ones in the Gospels, not even phenomenologically, but some kind of group experience. Now, Vaguest is probably the most unclear of all of those three. He's very difficult to pin down. He doesn't always say when a theory is his own or just one that he's considering. It's probably generous to take him to be acknowledging a group appearance, but it seems, may I say, it appears that he acknowledges some kind of spiritual-like group apparition experience. And he says these are of the same evidential value as mystical experiences throughout the centuries. Not very helpful, in other words. But something in a group. Gulder vaguely refers to what he calls mass delusion. And by, making such a big deal about how this wasn't at all like what was in the Gospels, he can make it sound like that's the kind of thing that happens a lot. I doubt it happens as often as he thinks it does. He tends to mash together things where different members of a social group, when they're by themselves, see things, and things that groups, when they're in groups, think they see. But he is including both. Ludemann is similar to Gulder in this regard. He says that the disciples all had some kind of seeing in the spirit or ecstasy while they were together. One does sometimes wonder if these could be satisfied by some kind of mere mental imagery where you just kind of close your eyes, like not even an unusual kind of hallucination, but just kind of close your eyes and imagine. But they may have something more hallucinatory in mind, but vision-like, not physical-like. Okay, and Ludemann and Gulder both seem to believe that there's such a thing as contagious hallucinations. And that's still not very helpful if all that these contagious hallucinations amount to is something like a mystical experience or some kind of feeling or whatever. But it's three guys. All right. Now, I don't want to get too tedious by going into too much detail, but I want to say a couple of things about Ehrman, Sanders, and Crossan. All right, because as you'll recall, they're in my list of skeptics. And all three of those are people that Habermas lists as acknowledging something or other exciting sounding about group experiences, and the Jesus Seminar as well. So Habermas was insistent both that Sanders is a non-believer and that he acknowledges group experiences. So I've tried to dig into every place where Habermas claims to footnote this from his recent books, and they just do not back it up. Instead, Sanders is insistent on complete agnosticism. And I think it's important when somebody says, we have no idea what happened. Something happened, but we don't know what happened. If they're that insistent, I think we should take that seriously. We shouldn't say, oh, you just mean we don't know a whole lot about what happened, or we don't know how it happened. No, he says we don't know what happened. And if he says that, believe the man, okay? That's what he thinks anyway. Now he says that fraud wasn't going on, but that's because Sanders says that all these stories, they're like the stories of George Washington and the cherry tree, and nobody really expected them to be believed. He punts to all these sweeping statements about ancient views of truth. You know how that goes. But when he goes into any more detail, he's insistently agnostic. Habermas even tells Licona in the live stream that Sanders says together. Licona tries to push it. He's like, in a group, together. Yes, together, says Habermas. That, Sanders is saying together. I cannot find any place where Sanders says that they had some kind of apparition experience or appearance-like experience together. I cannot find that word. I cannot find that implication. Nothing. That is Habermas's interpretation. One strand of how I think he got confused based upon his ways of quoting Sanders is that Sanders has this place where he has a list of things we can know. They're all very briefly stated at that point. Then he tells you more later about what he thinks, especially about the resurrection. And one of those is his followers saw him. I think Habermas takes it that when there's a plural like that, his followers saw him, that must mean his followers saw him when they were together. But that's exactly why, to his credit, Dr. Licona was pushing. Well, okay, but does it mean when they were in a group? Together. Yes, together. No, not together. Sanders never says together, as far as I can find. I've looked. I can't find any place where he says together. And that his followers saw him thing, in that list of facts we can know, that's just, he's trying to be really brief there. But then he has this whole, several page long thing about what we can know and what we cannot know. And he's very insistent. All right, that it's just, I can't get behind these data. We can't know what they experienced. We can't really know what happened. Something happened. We don't know what happened. Okay. Now, Ehrman, without going into too much detail again, but Habermas has tried to say that he acknowledges a group appearance to the women, which would be really weird to acknowledge a group appearance to the women but not to the men. And I looked up the passage, and it's again based on a misinterpretation. I think Habermas doesn't understand what a certain pronoun is referring to there. And also, Ehrman has been very, very explicit that he doesn't know if they had group experiences or not. He was like, I don't grant group experiences. He's been about as explicit as it can be. He'll say if they had group experiences, it would be like seeing at a distance. But that's not the same thing as I grant that they did. Now, same way with Christopher Knight, by the way. If they had group experiences, it would be like, some kind of distance thing, like a Marian apparition or whatever. But saying if they had it, this is what it would be like is not the same thing as saying they did have it. And Ehrman is as explicit as possible about that. Crossan doesn't grant group experiences. Habermas says that Crossan grants multiple attestation of group experiences, but when you do a deep dive, he really doesn't. He says that there were grief apparitions, but he doesn't commit himself at all on whether groups had these grief apparition experiences together. He'll say they, but again, saying they had visions or whatever doesn't mean they in a group. Other statements indicate that he wouldn't even say that the list in 1 Corinthians 15 is a list of apparition experiences. So he goes so far that Crossan says that list that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 15 is not about apparitions, but rather about authority, power, leadership, and priority. And he also says that the gospel stories are not documenting apparition experiences. Instead, they're documenting some kind of a tradition about experiencing Jesus' continued presence in their lives. So whatever apparition experiences Crossan thinks somebody or other had, they're hidden back behind all of the texts that we have, none of which are listing actual specific times or groups who had such experiences. And we don't have any way of getting back to more information. Even Lacona in his resurrection book has said that Crossan says that Paul's trance was the only actual apparition appearance experience. Now, I've documented in another video that Habermas is wrong when he says that Jesus Seminar thinks that group appearances are multiply independently attested. In fact, let this sink in, they explicitly color code the creed in 1 Corinthians 15. And they go through every single, line of that. And every single line that refers to a group experience, like then to the 12 and so forth, receives a color coding of either gray or, in the case of to all the apostles, black. Gray means possible but unreliable. And so, again, Lacona actually acknowledges in his resurrection book that the Jesus Seminar questions a group appearance experience. So it's not even like, oh yeah, they don't grant that the gospel stories give accurate summaries of what they experienced. But the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, no, they go through that and code it too. All right. So a second strand of misunderstanding is these other kinds of misinterpretation. Like, that Ehrman acknowledges a group appearance to the women, or that the Jesus Seminar is, say, acknowledging that the group appearances are multiply independently attested. As we saw in that other video, literally, Habermas is understanding certain places where they're just listing all of the sources that have any, story of a group appearance. They're just listing them all. Okay? But they don't say anything about them being independent. And in fact, they make it very clear that they don't think that they're independent. So we've got the Jesus Seminar against the admission of a group appearance. They code, needless to say, all the gospel group appearance stories are coded black. And then the lines in 1 Corinthians 15 are coded either gray or black. And gray is already, unreliable. Okay, so that gives us a larger number. Okay, well, how many? According to the book that Habermas is using, there were 79 members of the Jesus Seminar at the time of that stage of the project. Now, for all we know, they might have all scored the gray or black. That would be one way that we could get the outcome of their vote being gray or black. But I decided to try to use their weighting system because I don't want to overcount, right? How many of them were like, nah, didn't happen. What is the minimum number of scholars within that group of 79 who must have coded those either gray or black in order for that coding to be the final result of the voting process? By my calculation, the minimum would be 40. And if you tried to have, any fewer coding those things gray or black, moving it over to pink or red, you would be, the coding wouldn't have turned out that way. The upshot wouldn't have turned out that way given their weighting factors. All right, so that's the most careful we can be, is to say, at least 40. All right, now there's also some overlap. Crossan and Ludemann were at least at one time members of the Jesus Seminar, so I don't want to count Crossan and Ludemann twice. Ehrman, Sanders, Perrin, and Vermisch were not. I couldn't get clear information about others in my skeptic list, and I think they weren't, but just to make sure not to double count, I'm going to subtract 6 from that 40. If we just go with Habermas and we treat Vermisch and Sanders as non-believers, we have 44. that we're counting as skeptics. All right, so that's the named list that I gave, and then the scholars of the Jesus Seminar who voted no, either gray or black on a group experience. All right, so if we've got a total of 44, and only 3 of those granting a group appearance, of those skeptic non-believers, we only have 6%. So that's not even close to a simple majority, much less a large majority. And this is why Licona tried so hard to press Habermas. Can you name, can you name one skeptic? Okay, so we're definitely at that coupla stage here. Just a couple of skeptics, not a majority of skeptics. So why is Habermas treating group appearances as a minimal fact? Aside from some misinterpretations. Well, in addition to that, here's an interesting discussion between Habermas and Licona in that live stream. So here's Licona. Would you say a strong majority of scholars grant the group appearances? Habermas. They grant appearances, and since the majority of the appearances, and then he interrupts himself, if you're only going to count appearances to single individuals to get away from groups, I don't think that's fair. In the earliest account, and then Licona interrupts, I think it's fair. Licona says, I'm with Licona this time, okay? I mean, when we talk about answering hallucinations, one of the correct responses we give is group appearances. Habermas. Right. Licona. So it's fair for someone like Paulogia, that's the skeptical YouTuber who asked the question, to say, well, what percentage of scholars today in the field would grant the group appearances? Habermas. Yeah, and in the earliest creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 of the 5 are to groups. So you can't go in there and say, well, I'm going to take Peter and I'm going to take James, but I won't take 3 group appearances there. I mean, we've got to be fair with the data. There's 3 groups and 2 individuals in that particular list. This is crazy reasoning. Habermas seems to be saying that he gets to treat the majority of scholars, even the vast majority, and even a majority of skeptics, as granting group appearances because the majority of the appearances listed in 1 Corinthians 15 are group appearances. How do you get from the majority of the appearances in that list are group appearances to the majority of scholars grant group appearances? What? Well, because somehow it wouldn't be fair, just not fair, for a scholar to accept that Peter individually had an appearance, an individual appearance, but that there was not a group appearance. But we're not supposed to base what scholars do grant on what we think they should grant. For goodness sake, if Bart Ehrman were being fair with the data, he'd be a Christian. I think that's something Dr. Habermas and I and Dr. Licona, we would all agree on, right? I mean, if Ehrman were really doing what he should do, he would have a completely different evaluation of the data, but we're supposedly looking at what they actually do grant. And in fact, the Jesus Seminar does exactly what Habermas says. You can't go in there and do this. They code the appearance to Cephas, that line in 1 Corinthians 15, pink, which means that plausibly something like that happened. But all the group experiences are gray, or in one case, black. You can't say, you can't do that. Sorry, they just did. I don't know where this, you can't go in there. Yeah, they can. And Dr. Habermas, you're supposed to be telling us what they do. You're not supposed to count what they do based upon what you think they should do. It's nuts. In what follows, which I will not read in the interest of time, when Licona keeps pressing, Habermas appears to say that they, and in the context it looks like he's saying lots of skeptical scholars, would say that there are groups of people who would say that they saw the risen Jesus. And after that, they go into the discussion of Sanders. So Habermas clearly means here groups together. But he has no good evidence that lots of critical scholars would say that groups together had some kind of group experience which, as Lakota understandably defined it, was sufficiently similar that that's why they thought they were all seeing the same thing. All right. So, now, having acquiesced in categorizing Sanders and Vaguest with the non-believers or skeptics, what about the 7 moderates that I have left? And I've done a deep dive into these. Dale Allison, C.H. Dodd, James Dunn, Theodore Keim, Wolfhart Pannenberg, Reginald Fuller, and David Catchpole. Now, these are definitely not skeptics. So whatever these guys acknowledge, you don't get to say, look, skeptics acknowledge this. Their scholarship is very critical. From a conservative Christian perspective, it would certainly be thought of as liberal, so that's a relative perspective. Now, I mentioned this last time. I have very strongly said that Dale Allison should not be called a fellow believer, which Dr. Lakota most unfortunately has called him, and even asked him to talk about his prayer practices, like, we're all brothers in Christ or something. That's a theological question because he is actually dismissive of the bodily resurrection of Jesus having, internal organs and genital organs. That he mocks at that. Okay? Sorry, you don't get to be called a fellow believer whose prayer practices I want to hear about, if that's your perspective on Jesus' bodily resurrection. But we're talking about the scholarly spectrum here. And on the scholarly spectrum, Allison is definitely a moderate. He's an objective vision guy. He's not way over, on the far left of the scholarly spectrum. He thinks he, believes in something that actually happened. He just doesn't think, Jesus rose in a normal body or was seen in a body that could be, photographed and so forth. So that doesn't mean he's a creedal Christian, but that he definitely counts as a moderate rather than a skeptic. So it doesn't meet that definition of skeptic that I gave up above. Remember, which is somebody who's like nothing objectively, or, we have no reason to believe that anything objectively supernatural took place there. 4 of these are objective vision guys: Allison, Fuller, Pannenberg, and Keim. Not bodily in nature. Dodd, Dunn, and Catchpole are thought of, or were definitely thought of, as Christians. Dodd and Dunn received eulogistic obituaries talking about the depth of their Christian faith. Dodd evidently said in an interview toward the end of his life that he believed in life after death because of Jesus' resurrection. So calling them moderates is really wholly accurate, because they have this very critical scholarly approach. And here I don't just mean they're critical scholars in the sense that they're, they're credentialed or something. I mean their approach is critical. And I'll be talking more about that here. But they believe that some kind of quote-unquote resurrection or other really happened. Now, all of those 7 do acknowledge at least one group appearance experience. So we have this fairly abrupt switch with just, you've got like Vaguest and Sanders, where you're sort of like, should we count these guys as moderates or non-believers? Vaguest being pretty unclear, Sanders being very agnostic about what happened. But then you go over from, your skeptics who are like, they're not going to acknowledge a group experience. They may think they could explain it away if there was one, but they're not prepared to grant it to these moderates who are doing this kind of in-between thing where they're like, yeah, there was something, that happened to them all together. And it wasn't bodily seeming, but they did at least have, some kind of experience as a group. And these guys are carrying out these critical operations on the text. They're whittling it down. Catchpole, my goodness. I mean, I saw one place where somebody considered him to be an evangelical. I don't know why. He's got all these different recensions, as they're called, of the Gospels, and he speaks of them with great confidence. John number 2, or Luke number 3 or whatever. Like he can literally, like it's a layer cake that he can literally see. Dodd whittles things down and so forth. They're very well respected. They're certainly not thought of as fundamentalists or extremists on the right. Now, why is this important? Why am I emphasizing that? Well, because I think that this is the fourth strand in Habermas's confusing references to skeptics, and a vast majority are even acknowledging this, even so-and-so, and whatever. I think that when someone as well-respected as C.H. Dodd, whom no one would call a fundy, and he's going around chopping up the gospel narrative until he's whittled down to this itty-bitty little couple verses, thinks that the disciples did have some kind of group experience, Habermas gets very excited by that. He wants this to be some kind of a big win for the minimal facts argument. And I think what happens is, part of what is happening psychologically for him is that sort of morphs into his getting the impression, and is giving others the impression, that a lot of skeptical scholars grant at least one group appearance, even though Dodd would not be labeled as a skeptic. I mean, this is the guy who said because of the resurrection of Jesus, he had hope in an afterlife. I don't think he really believes in a clear bodily resurrection, okay, but he thought he believed in the resurrection. And I think we should look at this from a different and rather sobering perspective. If indeed, as seems to be indicated by this research I've just been summarizing for you, both skeptics and moderates represent those who are critical. They're not too evangelical. They're not over to the right on the scholarly spectrum, are saying these things, then it looks like there's a consensus of that group, including both moderates and skeptics, that the early Christians, including but not limited to the gospel authors, had no qualms about just making up entire incidents that never happened in order to physicalize the stories, to justify and rationalize the disciples' initial beliefs, express the inexpressible. These are some of the actual phrases that I've found in these scholars. Luke and John come in for special repeated mention here. It's pretty much unvarying that the place where Jesus in Luke says, see and touch me, that I am a spirit doesn't have flesh and bones as you see me have. Oh, that's an apologetic addition. So he's just doing all this kind of thing. This is a diverse consensus in its own right. And in fact, Dodd even seems to imply that in what we might call the earliest kerygma of the church, there were these apologetic expansions, like the women grasping Jesus' feet. That's part of what he calls a concise narrative. It's like 2 or 3 verses there in Matthew. Or then he showed them his hands and side. It's part of, it's like just 3 verses or whatever in John that he calls a concise narrative. But even in there, he thinks there are already these apologetic expansions to justify what they were saying. Now think about that for a minute. Here's Dodd. He's not a skeptic, but it almost sounds like he thinks the disciples themselves thought it was okay to lie in order to convince people of this. It's a very sobering thought. Dodd and Crossan are not at all on the same point on the scholarly spectrum. But if the only people who believe that the gospel accounts are not embellished and that the disciples had that kind of phenomenology are the ones who are accused of being fundamentalists and are not very critical, well, what then? Now, this doesn't bother me, but it should bother you. If you're looking for some kind of historical bedrock that is agreed upon across ideological boundaries, and that will supposedly allow you as a Christian to think that you've corrected your own biases by nose-counting scholars who agree with you on this over here while taking a very critical attitude toward the Gospels over there. Well, those guys who take a critical attitude, the skeptics and the moderates, agree about the invention of these bodily aspects of the accounts by the authors, or even by the church even earlier than the writing down of the documents. If that were really the case, that these physical details were made up, that would actually be evidence against the bodily resurrection. Fuller says that they just had a visual experience of light and experienced some sort of communication of meaning. Those who take an objective vision view are quite definite that it was not observable in a neutral way. If that were true, then it looks like the gospel authors and the Christian community didn't have true stories to tell about Jesus appearing bodily, because they could have just told those. If there were true stories about him appearing on earth, walking around, and manifesting himself in bodily ways, why would they tell these made-up stories? So if you really knew that the only experience that people had was an experience that looked visionary, it was like, very brief, he appears there, he says a few words, then that's evidence against the bodily resurrection. So, does a majority of skeptical scholars, to sum up, grant even some kind of group resurrection experience, even a visionary type with some degree of intersubjectivity? Very probably no. And if that's part of what it means for it to be a minimal fact, then that is not a minimal fact. If you even need more than a couple of skeptical scholars to acknowledge it, if you even need a lot of skeptical scholars to acknowledge it for it to be a minimal fact, then very probably no, it isn't. Okay? Does a majority of moderate scholars, somewhat liberal, maybe even a lot liberal in comparison to conservative believers, grant that there was some kind of group experience? Yeah, probably. Is that helpful to a strong case for the bodily resurrection? Not really. In fact, if we're making something epistemologically of what is granted by a diverse consensus of those who are not downright conservative, that could actually be harmful to the case. And if they're right, it would be harmful. If you're looking at the critical methods common to all of these scholars, moderate and skeptical alike, as having some sort of claim to represent what we might call best practices, the way that real, qualified, professional, historical scholars do things when they are not moved by overly conservative biases, that's going to have an impact upon what you think can be shown in an objective historical way. Can historians even have objective reason to believe that the original disciples claimed that they had these detailed experiences? Let me close by reading a quote to you from Dr. Lacona's Resurrection book, where he believes, relying on Dr. Habermas at that time, that a vast majority of scholars across the spectrum granted at least one group appearance. But I want you to hear what he says. Historians, qua historians, can and cannot know qua historians, and just ponder on the if that's all they have, okay, and just ponder on the ramifications of this for a strong resurrection case. All right, this is Lacona on pages 371 to 372. In a similar manner, historians may conclude that subsequent to Jesus' death by crucifixion, a number of his followers had experiences in individual and group settings that convinced them Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. We may affirm with great confidence that Peter had such an experience in an individual setting, and we will see that the same may be said of an adversary of the church named Paul. We may likewise affirm that there was at least one occasion when a group of Jesus' followers, including the 12, had such an experience. Did other experiences reported by the Gospels occur as well, such as the appearances to the women, Thomas, the Emmaus disciples, and the multiple group appearances reported by the tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, and in John? Where did these experiences occur? Historians may be going beyond what the data warrants in assigning a verdict with much confidence to these questions. And I'm going to tell you something very different. I'm going to tell you that historians are not going beyond what the data warrant in drawing conclusions with confidence about those questions. And it starts with a much better understanding of what the Gospels are. But in the meanwhile, please don't be telling people that the majority of skeptics believe in group appearances. But we can do better than that. Okay, next time, I think I'm going to be talking about an ancient novel and the historical genre of the Gospels. So a completely different topic. So I hope you'll come back next time to the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.